Enough to hear Scott Horton first speak in his podcast about a year ago. Also very lucky to see him speak in person at the Mises Bash in Pittsburgh last spring, and also at the PorcFest in New Hampshire. He is a dynamic speaker, and he is the go-to guy for libertarian policy, libertarian foreign policy. Scott Horton is the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, host of Anti-War Radio on Pacifica 90.7 FM KPFK in Los Angeles, California, and podcast The Scott Horton Show from scotthorton.org. He's the author of the 2021 book, Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism, the 2017 book, Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and editor of the 2019 book, The Great Ron Paul, The Scott Horton Show Interviews, 2004 through 2019. He's conducted more than 5,500 interviews since 2003, and he's also lectured countless times for various groups around the country and the world. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Scott Horton.
Hi everybody, how you doing? Yeah, I appreciate y'all having me here today. Alright. This is the basic recap of the book speech here of Enough Already. I'm going to go over the last 40 years of foreign policy for you really fast and take you through it. But I was reminded hanging out with some friends here, some new friends last night, of how many people in our group were little kids when the war on terror started. And we're living so deep in the future now, you can see how gray my beard has become. That there are people who are grown adult members of the Libertarian Party now who don't remember September 11th or the aftermath of it whatsoever. So I'm actually going to start back when I was a little kid, to the stuff that I just barely remember, which is really the prelude to the war on terrorism of this century. See if I can get us all caught up on the same page. Now, one thing about the book and about what I'm about to tell you guys is there's not too much of this that's top secret stuff. A little bit of like Bill Clinton supporting the terrorists in Chechnya. That didn't get the front page of the Washington Post. But most of what I'm here to talk about is stuff that we all already know. For example, Saddam Hussein was backed by the Reagan administration in the 1980s to fight against Iran. Actually, Iran was backed by the Reagan administration in the 1980s to fight against Iraq. Everybody already knows that. But I'm here basically to draw a through line for you and explain why these things happened and why they were important and how they led to the next intervention and the crisis that we've been suffering through all the way through today. So we start in 1979, aka 1953, when the CIA overthrew the democratically elected government in Iran, and they reinstalled the dictator, the Shah Reza Pahlavi. Now, after about 25 years of that, the Shah was sick and his government was falling apart, and the end of 1978, revolution broke out across Iran. Now, it's interesting to point out here, I think it's worth pointing out. I remember even being confused as a kid, seeing the footage of the Ayatollah Khomeini getting on an airplane in Paris, France, to go home to Iran to inherit the revolution. And I remember even thinking as a kid, but aren't the French our buddies? And wouldn't they not send the guy home to Iran if we didn't want them to? And the answer is that the CIA and the State Department advised Jimmy Carter to tell the French to go ahead and send the Ayatollah home. We know this guy. He's an old friend of ours. Him and his group helped us overthrow Mossadegh back in 1953. We can work with him. And State Department Ambassador William Sullivan even compared the Ayatollah to Mahatma Gandhi. So this is going to be fine. The Shah was dying of cancer anyway. What were they going to do? So they sent the Ayatollah home, the Shiite Ayatollah Khomeini home, to inherit the revolution. And of course, it became the Shiite fundamentalist religious revolution. And the Ayatollahs and their Mullah committee has ruled Iran ever since, the Islamic Republic. Now, one thing that's really regretful about the Iranian Revolution, or the story told about the Iranian Revolution in America, is that memories tend to blur two very separate events together. The first was the revolution, which was complete by the end of February 1979. But the hostage crisis didn't break out until November. The Americans always essentially just think of the whole event as one big thing. There was a revolution, they seized the hostages, they burned our flag and called us the great Satan, and their horrible religion makes them hate us, etc. But that's not the way it happened. The way it happened was the Carter government continued to try to get along with the Ayatollah all through the year 1979, passing the new government intelligence on threats from the Soviet Union and from the newly coup d'etat installed dictator of Iraq, Saddam Hussein. But then what happened was in November, David Rockefeller, the chairman of the Chase Manhattan Bank, convinced Jimmy Carter to allow his friend, the Shah, into the United States for cancer treatment. And the people of Iran, the students of Iran, took that as a signal that we were going to do a coup and overthrow the revolution and reinstall the Shah again. And so that was what caused the riot and the seizing of the hostages at the embassy. I'm not saying it was justified, but I'm saying it's understandable, particularly when you reflect on the fact that the coup of '53 was plotted at that same embassy. And so they were trying to preempt that. And it's that hostage crisis then that has led to the enmity between the United States and Iran that exists to this day. Now, another important event that began in 1979 was Jimmy Carter's support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. This began in July when he signed a finding, that's an order to the CIA, telling them to begin to support the Mujahideen. And they had a deliberate plan to provoke the Soviet Union into invading. The reason for this was because after the Vietnam disaster, the American people had this mental illness, as our government conceived it, Vietnam syndrome. The American people didn't want to go to war in any of these proxy wars against the Soviets and their allies anymore. So the thinking in the Carter government was, well, listen, if the American people don't want to extend all this effort into containing Soviet communism, maybe we could get clever and we'll bait them into overexpansion. Now, we don't want them in West Germany, but what if we could lure them into Afghanistan? We'll give them their own Vietnam, which is, of course, by then a shorthand term for a distant, no-win quagmire that breaks the bank and divides the society back home and that you wish you'd never done. And they said, well, Vietnam was so hard for us that we even have this Vietnam syndrome as the legacy of it. Let's do the same thing to them. And that was the thinking behind their support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Now, that was actually not the reason the Soviets invaded. Their communist sock puppet dictator was such a basket case and was causing such dissension and civil war inside the country that the Soviets essentially invaded the first thing they did was take him out back and shoot him in the head and replace him and install a new government in power. But it doesn't matter. The point is still the same, that was what the American government thought at the time, is we want to provoke the Soviets into invading Afghanistan, to bog them down and bleed them to bankruptcy in the Vietnam style. Now, once the Soviets did invade Afghanistan in December of 1979, all of a sudden the Carter government panicked and said, oh no, geez, if they were to go into destabilized revolutionary Iran next, they could seize the Persian Gulf. They'd be the dominant power of the Persian Gulf. And they'd have a route around the Pakistani mountains and be able to seize the port of Karachi on the Pakistani coast on the Indian Ocean. This would be a major expansion of Soviet power. And so, in order to prevent that, they essentially gave a war guarantee to Iran, which they hated, which we're in the middle of this dispute over the hostages at the time. But in the State of the Union address of 1980, Carter announced what's called the Carter Doctrine, where he said that the Persian Gulf is an American lake, and any attempt by any power to dominate the Persian Gulf, in his words, would be treated as an attack on the United States of America. No different than if somebody tried to invade Canada or England. We will go to war to protect our sovereignty over the Persian Gulf. And as part of that Carter Doctrine, they started building up bases throughout the region, especially in Saudi, but also in Qatar, Bahrain, and UAE. And Carter gave the green light to the new dictator of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, to invade revolutionary Iran to try to overthrow the Ayatollah's dictatorship. That led to the 8-year-long Iran-Iraq war. which ended up killing about 500,000 people on both sides. Ronald Reagan came in, and he continued both policies, picked up right where Carter had left off, supported the Mujahideen in Afghanistan throughout the 1980s, and supported the CIA in an effort allied with the Saudis and with the Pakistanis to send tens of thousands of so-called Arab Afghans to go to Afghanistan to fight. These are Libyans, Syrians, Saudis, and people from Chechnya and the Philippines and even the United States went to Afghanistan to fight against the Soviet Union in the 1980s. He also continued support for Saddam Hussein in the Iran-Iraq War, including even financing the purchase from European companies of chemical weapons, including sarin and Tabun nerve gas, and provided the Iraqis with American satellite intelligence that they could use to better target Iranian conscript forces in what was the worst chemical warfare on the planet since World War I. And, but then that led to a couple of problems. The first one was that when the war came to an end, it was essentially a stalemate. The border hadn't really changed. When the war came to an end, Saddam Hussein was deep in debt. He had borrowed billions of dollars from the Saudis, the Qataris, the Emiratis, and the Kuwaitis, in order to wage that war, which he saw quite correctly as being fought to a degree on their behalf to keep the Shiite revolution out of Kuwait and out of northeastern Saudi Arabia, especially where all the oil happens to be sitting under where the Shiite minority lives in northeastern Saudi. So the Kuwaitis not only were demanding that Saddam Hussein pay back all of his loans immediately, but oil was trading at something like $10 a barrel, so he had no way to pay them back, much less rebuild his country. And they were also being deliberately insulting, saying things like, oh, well, if you can't pay us money, maybe you just send us all your war widows as recompense. Well, imagine if a real American enemy, the Russians or the Germans or someone, had said that to us. Well, just send us your war widows. That'll pay us off, right? But think of the level of insult there. So the Iraqis were pissed, and Saddam Hussein on July 25th, 1990, called the American ambassador, April Glaspie, in for a meeting and threatened, well, she warned that, listen, you know, we don't like what you're doing on the border here. But she didn't give him a specific warning, and in fact, much of her language could be construed as at least a flashing yellow light to Saddam Hussein to go ahead and invade the northern oil fields of Kuwait, where the Kuwaitis were overproducing from shared oil wells in the Rumelia oil field there. And in fact, she said, Secretary Baker has emphasized to me that I should emphasize to you the instruction. The Kuwaiti border dispute is not associated with America. And George Bush, the president, is not looking to have any war in the Middle East. And this was taken as a green light, because of course there wasn't going to be a war against Kuwait. It was a coup de main, and marched right in and took over the whole thing. And as many administration sources said at the time, well, geez, we didn't think he was going to take the whole country. The permission was to invade and occupy the northern oil fields. Once he took over the whole country, then Margaret Thatcher got upset, the Prime Minister of Britain, because even though the Americans had very few interests in Kuwait, the British were heavily invested in Kuwaiti oil, and the Kuwaiti royal family was heavily invested in British sovereign debt. And so what happened was, in her people's words, the British gave George H.W. Bush a backbone transplant, warning him, don't you go wobbly on me, Bush. And then, only then did Bush announce, this will not stand, and we will reverse this aggression, and announce the New World Order and the rest of that. And then he spent the second half of the year 1990 absolutely refusing to negotiate with Saddam Hussein, when Hussein offered over and over and over again to negotiate his way out of the Gulf. He just wanted the slightest bit of face saving, and they wouldn't give it to him. That would be a reward. And because they wanted their war. Now, everyone remembers Iraq War I, 1991, as being short and sweet, US space-age technology, guided by satellites and laser designators, completely obliterated the Soviet-created army of the Iraqis. And that's all you need to know about that. Except that that was 30 years ago. And we've been bombing Iraq ever since. And I'm not rounding up. That was 30 years ago. And we've been bombing Iraq ever since. What happened? Well, it's like this. Some of you remember, some of you probably don't remember. The Shiite and Kurdish uprising that took place about 6 weeks after the end of the war, 3 or 4 weeks after the end of the war. Some of you may have seen the movie Three Kings with Marky Mark and Ice Cube and George Clooney. It's a gold heist, but the setting is the aftermath of the First Iraq War and the Shiite uprising against Saddam Hussein's government, and then, if you remember the movie very well, Saddam Hussein's government crushing that Shiite uprising. Well, here's what happened. George Bush Sr. went on Voice of America radio and told them to rise up and overthrow Saddam Hussein, implying that the United States would back their efforts. And the Air Force dropped leaflets over Iraqi army divisions saying, now's your chance to get rid of Saddam Hussein. And so they did. And they started marching on Baghdad. But then H.W. Bush changed his mind. He choked. And he let Saddam Hussein, in the negotiations at the end of the war, let him keep his attack helicopters and his tanks enough to crush the Kurdish and Shiite uprising that he personally had encouraged just a week or two before. Why? What happened? Here's what happened. The Iraqis who had chosen Iran's side in the Iran-Iraq War, the Iraqis who had chosen their Shiite identity over their Iraqi and Arab identity, they were leading the revolution. They were coming across the border from Iran, namely the Bada Brigade of Iraqi Shiites. If they had taken over Baghdad, then that would have been a huge goal for the Ayatollah. So the H.W. Bush government, of course, was made up of all men from the Reagan years, right? Colin Powell had been the National Security Advisor, H.W. Bush had been the Vice President, Brent Scowcroft, I forgot exactly, but anyway, all of them except Dick Cheney, who was in Congress at the time. He was the Secretary of Defense under H.W. Bush. But virtually the rest, James Baker was the Chief of Staff. This was the follow-on from the Reagan years. These were the same men who had just spent a decade backing Saddam Hussein to contain the Iranian Revolution. Now, they were importing it. And so they panicked and called it off. And they let Saddam Hussein then kill more than 100,000 people right under their nose, right under their nose, in order to crush that insurrection. Now, then they said, oh no, look at what a bastard Saddam Hussein is. Now we have to stay in Saudi Arabia. And because we have to patrol the no-fly zones over northern and southern Iraq with our British friends, and originally the French as well, in order to prevent Saddam Hussein from finishing the job and exterminating all these Shiites and Kurds. Well, what a load of crap. He'd already put down the insurrection. It was over. That was it. There was no policy by Saddam Hussein to kill every last Shiite till they were dead, the supermajority population of his country. That wasn't it. He was just putting down the insurrection. But this became the excuse for the Americans to stay and to leave their bases in Saudi Arabia. And then that became the #1 motive for the Arab-Afghan Mujahideen that Reagan had supported in the 1980s to turn against the United States. When Bill Clinton came in, he essentially continued this exact same policy. In the book, I call it Iraq War 1.5. He kept the blockade, all of the UN sanctions and the virtual global embargo on Iraq, and he kept bombing them from bases in Saudi Arabia for the entire 8 years of his presidency. According to the Washington Post, on average, every other day for 8 years, America bombed Iraq. Now, at this point, Al-Qaeda started attacking us. The first real Al-Qaeda attack in the United States was the assassination of the radical right-wing rabbi Kahane in New York City in 1990. Next, they tried to blow up the World Trade Center in 1993, and luckily only killed 6 people, but almost succeeded in toppling one tower over into the other. The ATF raided the Branch Davidians' home a couple of days later, and all attention turned to Waco and away from the very narrowly avoided absolute catastrophe in New York City a couple of days before that. And then, of course, there were attacks overseas by Al-Qaeda, and this Al-Qaeda was essentially Egyptian Islamic Jihad merging with bin Laden's group, which was focused mostly on the Saudis. So it's kind of proto-Al-Qaeda started attacking us during this time. And they attacked the National Guard in 1995 in Saudi Arabia, where American soldiers were training Saudi internal police. They tried to bomb a hotel in Yemen in '92. They bombed the Khobar Towers. Who remembers the Khobar Towers bombing from 1996 in Saudi Arabia? Okay, so if you remember, you might remember that even to this day, in fact, they blame Iranian-backed Saudi Hezbollah for the Khobar Towers attack. Well, that's a bunch of crap. It was Osama bin Laden and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed who did it. And who was it that they bombed? American airmen in their barracks. Guys whose job it was to bomb and blockade Iraq from their bases in Saudi Arabia. By blaming it on Iran across the Gulf, which was not being occupied and had no reason to attack us whatsoever, Louis Freeh and Bill Clinton and their government really robbed the American people of an opportunity to learn the reality that there are some right-wing religious radicals in Saudi Arabia who want us the hell off of their property, and they're willing, and their holy land, and are willing even to commit suicide attacks in order to drive us out of there. Instead, that conversation didn't take place at all. In fact, the biggest scandal in America about the Khobar Towers attack was that after it happened, a lady yelled, "You suck," at Bill Clinton at a rally. Because after the Beirut attack of '83, you would think that you would have good security around a barracks where American soldiers are sleeping on foreign territory like that. And Bill Clinton had the lady arrested and held for 2 days. That was the biggest scandal about the Khobar Towers attack. Not bin Laden and Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan's other friends from the 1980s are now turning against us because we have our troops where they are more than unwelcome. And then, of course, was the African embassy attacks of 1998, Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, Nairobi, Kenya, and the USS Cole attack of the year 2000 that killed 17 sailors and almost succeeded in sinking an American battleship at port in Aden, Yemen. Now, during all of this time, the Bill Clinton government was still backing these terrorists. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was the lead organizer of the September 11th attacks, he and his men were supported by Bill Clinton fighting in Bosnia in 1994. That was where he earned his stripes and credibility as a Mujahideen leader. They also supported them in the war in Chechnya. Many people know that Bill Clinton essentially paid the entire tab of Vladimir Putin and Boris Yeltsin's war in Chechnya, 2 wars in Chechnya in 97 and 99. But fewer know that the CIA backed the Chechen side of the war at the same time. Got to keep a pipeline from running through the Caucasus Mountains there. And I guess the idea was that if we could find a way to help these guys out, maybe they'll leave us alone. In fact, after September 11th, Bill Clinton and 2 of his Democratic allies from the U.S. House of Representatives, Brad Sherman and Tom Lantos, all 3 said something very close to, how could these Muslims attack us after everything that we've done for them lately? And the answer was, because we still had our bases in Saudi Arabia, we still supported Israel and their occupations of the Palestinians and the Lebanese, we still had support for all of the dictators in the Middle East and continued pressure on them to keep oil prices artificially low to subsidize our economy at their expense, and all the rest of bin Laden and his men's complaints against the United States. They hadn't called off any of those policies. So they had bribed, or they had used and paid these Mujahideen in the 1990s, but they had failed to bribe and buy their loyalty. Then, when September 11th hit, before that, sorry. So I talked about the motive, but it's important to talk about the strategy and why the Al-Qaeda guys were doing these attacks against the United States. Now, there's an argument that says that they were just trying to scare us away. Bin Laden himself said, well, America turned tail and ran after the Beirut bombing of 1983, and they left Somalia after the Black Hawk Down episode 10 years later in 1993, and so all we got to do is kill a few Americans, and they're a paper tiger, they'll turn around and run away. And there are a lot of people who cite those statements by bin Laden and say, see, that's why we have to go double down, triple down, quadruple down, and never leave. because he said we're weak and we'll leave. So we got to do the opposite of that and stay. I submit to you that bin Laden was simply taunting the Americans. That by the time of the September 11th attack, which killed 3,000 people, but let's get real, could have killed 20,000 if those towers had come down sooner. Could have been, the kind of thing that could get a country nuked, that level of attack on the United States. Bin Laden didn't think we were going to turn tail and run. He was trying to provoke America into acting stupid, into invading Afghanistan. As Saul Alinsky, the leftist radical, put it, in all asymmetric political actions, including terrorism, the action is in the reaction of the opposition. What is it that bin Laden was trying to do? Here's a group of 400 bandits in exile on the Afghan-Pakistan border, and they're trying to take on the global superpower. How are they supposed to do that? Well, they've got to give us the opportunity to destroy ourselves. The very same thinking that the Democrats had deployed against the Soviet Union in the 1980s, they were just turning around the same thing on us. Trick us into, or give our government an opportunity to exploit, to invade Afghanistan, to bog us down, lead us to bankruptcy, and force our empire out of the region the long way and the hard way, just as they had done with American help against the Soviet Union in the 1980s. In fact, I have all kinds of evidences in the book, but I'll just cite here real quick. Bin Laden's son Omar gave an interview to Rolling Stone magazine in 2010 when bin Laden was still alive. And he said, listen, in the Clinton years, America was very smart. My father would attack y'all's sites, and then he'd send some cruise missiles after him. Now, Bill Clinton didn't get my father, but now look at you. You've invaded Afghanistan, you've occupied the country for 10 years, you spent hundreds of billions of dollars, and you still haven't gotten my father. In Clinton's time, America was smart, not like the bull that runs after the red scarf. He said, I was in Afghanistan in the summer of the year 2000. When Bush won, my father was so happy. This is the kind of president he needs, one who will attack and break the country. Okay, so bin Laden didn't look at Bush and say, oh no, what a tough hombre, this macho character from West Texas is going to come with all of his armament and firepower and hurt me. That was the point. He saw W. Bush as the perfect mark, kind of person who he could easily manipulate into doing the wrong thing. And by the way, people get mad at me sometimes for saying this because it sounds like I'm acquitting poor stupid George W. Bush. He was trying his very best but made a big mistake. But that's not the story. Look, bin Laden, unlike the Taliban, was no caveman. He was the son of a billionaire with an engineering degree. He traveled the world. He knew what he was doing. This wasn't a matter of fooling a good president who was trying to do well. The whole point in the first place was to provide the American government with a crisis to exploit, because he knew that's exactly what they would do. And that's what he was counting on, that they would make the same mistake that the Soviets did and invade Afghanistan. And then that's exactly what W. Bush did. As soon as he invaded Afghanistan, they clearly made the decision. I make the circumstantial case in both books, but it's essentially impossible to avoid the conclusion that they deliberately let bin Laden go. They knew where his Lion's Den hideout was at Tora Bora in the Nangarhar province. CNN and ABC News and Robert Fisk from The Independent and Abd al-Bari Atwan from Al-Quds Al-Arabi, they had all gone there and interviewed bin Laden in the 1990s. They could have dropped massive firepower and paratroopers, the 75th Rangers, right on Tora Bora from the very beginning. But they didn't. Instead, they sent all the Rangers and all the Green Berets up north to Mazar-e-Sharif to help General Dostum, the communist, fight his enemies, the Taliban, and sent the rest down to Kandahar City, again to overthrow the Taliban and change their regime. But the Taliban weren't the ones who had attacked us. It was their guests, Al-Qaeda, who had, and in fact they'd even tried to warn us that an attack was coming. This was a big bait and switch. And if you read the memoirs of the CIA commander on the ground at Tora Bora, Gary Berntsen, the book is called Jawbreaker, or the memoirs of the Delta Force commander on the ground there. His name is Thomas Greer, aka Dalton Fury, wrote a book called Kill Bin Laden. And they talk about how over and over and over and over again, they were denied the reinforcements that they demanded to help seal the Pakistani border and prevent bin Laden and his friends from escaping from Tora Bora. And they had them. They had Green Berets, thousands of Green Berets up north. They had thousands of Army Rangers who were already occupying the Bagram Air Base north of Kabul. And they had the entire 75th Rangers, which is thousands of men, down in Kandahar, as well as, you all know General James Mattis from his time as Donald Trump's Secretary of Defense. He had 4,000 marching Marines and was begging to be allowed to go and get involved in the fight in Tora Bora. And he was turned down over and over again. They all were. And if you read the words of Berntsen and Greer, they just say over and over again, we just couldn't understand it. Come on. They needed their enemy to escape. Who cares if Saddam Hussein is friends with Osama bin Laden if bin Laden's already dead? And the American people believe that justice has been done, he's been gotten dead or alive, and that's what you get for messing with the USA. We kill you and we're home by Christmas. They didn't want that. They wanted to expand the war. And you know, I just read this, I'm sorry I'm killing my own time here, but I just read this the other day. It was in Task and Purpose, the military news site. And they had a story about the Air Force air controller who was on the ground at Tora Bora in December 2001. And he told the story of how his job was, you know, radio communication, bringing all the planes into the area, and then directing them to their targets as well, as laser designators and the rest. And at one point, there had been a friendly fire incident somewhere in Kandahar or something, and so all airstrikes in the country were called off for a short period of time, except at Tora Bora. So this Air Force air controller had every American plane in the theater at his disposal to bomb this one little square mile area of these mountains. And then you read the article a little bit further, and you get to the part where the guy says, yep, and then they called us out of there on December 8th. And that was the last airstrike. If I had known that already, I had forgotten that. The last airstrike was on December the 8th. Well, bin Laden didn't get away until December the 17th. So not only did they deprive them of the ground forces they needed to seal the border and win that fight, but they even called off all of their airstrike support. 10 days almost before bin Laden finally got away. And as every single person in this room, no matter your age, has heard probably 100 times, once bin Laden slipped across the border into Pakistan, well, that was it. It was just like he crossed the state line and the sheriff has to come to a screeching halt and stomp on his hat. I'm sorry, sir, they just jumped to light speed. They could be on the other side of the galaxy by now. Except that, no, they're not. They're right there. There's only 3 valleys that you can use to escape from Tora Bora in that area in Nangarhar province into Pakistan. And we know from Thomas Greer, aka Dalton Fury, that the Delta Force had numerous plans to chase after them. To mine the valleys, they were going to get in their Chinooks. You know, the Delta Force has helicopters, unlike bin Laden. They were going to get in their Chinooks, go into Pakistan, and then come over the mountains from the east and head them off at the pass. They're the Delta Force. They're on a mission. And they were denied permission over and over and over again to continue the hunt. And in fact, the New York Times just a couple of weeks ago had one where I guess the guy in charge of the thesaurus at the editor's desk said, you know, we've used slipped across the borders so many times now. How about melted across the border? They melted. Right, because otherwise they're just human men and you can see them and shoot them and kill them. That's too easy. So they melted. No wonder it's hard to find them when they turn to liquid and they're squishing their way across Pakistan. Yeah. Anyway, I spent way too much time on that part. But I need to get to why they wanted bin Laden alive so bad. It's because they wanted to get to Iraq. They wanted to frame Saddam Hussein, pretend that he was friends with bin Laden, that he could give his weapons of mass destruction to bin Laden to then use against you and your mama. And we have to go and preempt this coming attack from the alliance of Saddam and Osama come to get us. And it was just a lie. Now, they all had their different motives. Of course, W. Bush wanted to prove that he was smarter and tougher than his father. Most people don't know, but Dick Cheney had done a terrible job as CEO of Halliburton. He bought a company called Dresser Industries just weeks before the court decisions started coming in, finding Dresser liable for literally billions of dollars of asbestos cancer claims. So Dick Cheney owed Halliburton big. And those guys are gangsters. They are dangerous. So that was obviously Cheney's motivation, was he's going to put Halliburton and Kellogg Brown and Root on the Army dole, and he was going to make them whole again for what a bad job he'd done as CEO of their company in the 1990s. And Donald Rumsfeld, remember, had been the Secretary of Defense before. He wanted to come in and pull his big alpha dog thing over all the generals and force the program of transformation of the military. At the time, there were all different arguments about, okay, the military needs transformation, but how and in what way? Well, Rumsfeld wanted to favor the Air Force and Special Operations Forces at the expense of the land army. And so that was a big part of why he wanted to go to Iraq. He wanted to prove that with a small number of troops and with air power, sponsored by Lockheed, we could go in there, smash the regime, and then turn around and leave. Let the UN or the French or somebody else handle the aftermath, the State Department. But he wanted to prove that America's military could be light and fast, go in, do a regime change, and then move on to the next one, the next one, the next one. That was his motive. And then we come to the Neoconservatives. Now, the Neoconservatives inside the Bush government were represented, I'll leave a few names off here, but going from memory here. In the Vice President's office, most importantly, was Scooter Libby, John Hanna, and Harold Rode. On the National Security Council was Stephen Hadley and Robert Joseph. In the State Department was David Wormser and John Bolton, even though Bolton is actually not a neoconservative. He's a Goldwater conservative, but a right-wing nationalist, and has always been very close to and had common cause with the neocons, so counts as an honorary neocon kind of. And then in the Pentagon, you had Richard Pearl, Kenneth Edelman, Gene Kirkpatrick, Newt Gingrich, which again he's a conservative, not a neocon, but very close to them. They all sat on the Defense Policy Board. Paul Wolfowitz was made Deputy Secretary of Defense, and Douglas Feith, Deputy Secretary of Defense for Policy. He then hired a guy named Abram Shulsky, who, another neocon, who brought in Michael Rubin and Michael Ledeen and all different neoconservatives from the think tanks to come in and create in the Pentagon what they called the Office of Special Plans and the Policy Counterterrorism Evaluation Group. And these groups' job was to dig through the CIA's trash, to find the lies, to lead us to war. And they were also the most responsible for funneling the lies from the Iraqi exiles, with all of their claims about the weapons of mass destruction and ongoing programs there. And why did the neocons want so badly to get rid of Saddam Hussein? I mean, obviously the one-word answer is Israel, but why did Ariel Sharon and Benjamin Netanyahu want to get rid of Saddam Hussein? And the answer was, this isn't going to make much sense, okay? But don't blame me, it's them that are stupid and crazy. All right, everybody picture the Middle East. I know you got wonderful geography lessons in your government schools. The neoconservatives were concerned about Hezbollah in southern Lebanon on Israel's northern border. Hezbollah is armed by Iran by way of Syria. The thinking was, we need to break that chain. And then, as David Wormser wrote in his 1996 paper, A Clean Break, A New Strategy for Securing the Realm, the best way to undermine Iran's alliance with Syria and Hezbollah is to focus on getting rid of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. The Sunni Ba'athist dictator who right now is standing as the roadblock between Iran and Syria. Well, how does that make any sense? Well, here was what they thought. And they've been sold this pile of garbage by Ahmed Chalabi, the Iraqi exile, and they believed it because they wanted to. They said, what's going to happen is we're going to overthrow Saddam Hussein, and then the king of Jordan will take over Iraq. Because he's a Hashemite, and will have no problem ruling Iraq. And the Shiite supermajority, 60%, don't worry about them. They just love bending over and being told what to do by anyone who claims to have the blood of the prophet running through their veins. And so the Hashemite king of Jordan, when he takes over Iraq, will be able to lord it over the Shiite supermajority, and he'll have the Shiite clerics in Najaf. For those of you who don't know, Shiite Islam was born in Iraq and then was expanded into Iran in the first place. So the holy sites and all of that are in Iraq, and the highest ranking Shiite religious leaders are in the city of Najaf in the south. And Chalabi convinced the neocons that the new Jordanian king of Iraq will be able to tell the Shiite clergy in Najaf to tell Hezbollah to stop being friends with Iran and to be friends with Israel instead. And don't worry, they'll just bend over and do it because they'll do whatever somebody says if they have the blood of the prophet in their veins. And the Hashemites claim to be descended from Muhammad. But guess what? The Shiites worship, or not really worship, but revere an entirely separate line of descendants of Muhammad. They do not revere the Hashemites. They don't give a damn about the Hashemites. And when the British had installed a Hashemite king in Iraq in the 1920s, the Shiites had had a fatwa forbidding anyone from cooperating with him in any way, which had helped to lead to his collapse. In other words, David Wormser is an idiot. Okay? But this is what the neocons thought. This is why and how they convinced themselves that getting rid of Saddam Hussein in Iraq will be a benefit to Israel. Chalabi had even promised that they'll build an oil and water pipeline from Mosul to Haifa. And the Israelis bought that too. Ariel Sharon had his government engineers get ready to dusting off the old blueprints to see if they could recreate the old British pipeline, which is complete fantasy. Never happened. So what did happen? What did happen was W. Bush picked up right where his father had left off when he betrayed the Shiite uprising in 1991. And W. Bush came and he took Iran's best friends and he marched with them all the way to Baghdad. And then what? You guys know the rest of the story. America fought an 8-year civil war to put the Shiite supermajority in power in Baghdad and to cleanse Baghdad, as they call it, of Sunni Arabs. It was a mixed city, about 50-50 with some Christians, but 49-49 Sunni Shiite in Baghdad. It's now an 85 to 90% Shiite city. That was accomplished by the United States Army and Marine Corps. No one else could have been able to succeed in doing it. And they've now made a permanent change and moved that line. If you look at the ethnic and sectarian borders in the Middle East, they took that line of the Shiite border and they moved it just one little click there to the west, encompassing all of Iraq. That was what that whole war was for. And then what happened? They're the supermajority. They're allied with the Iranians next door. They didn't need us at all. So in 2008, when George Bush was on his last year as linked up president, they told him, sign here and get the hell out. Thanks very much for winning a war for us. Now don't let the door hit you in the ass on the way out to Kuwait. And Bush said, well, I'd like to have 64 military bases, please. And the guy that he put in power, Nouri al-Maliki, said, well, let me check with the guys. I'm sorry, they say, no, can't do it. Bush said, well, how about 50? Let me see, we'll have a vote and see. And they kept doing this all through the summer and into the fall of 2008. And by the end of 2008, Maliki said, sign on the line. And he was Iran's guy, too. The Americans sided with the Iranian-backed factions more than anyone else on the very bad bet that they will need our money and weapons more than they need the Iranians next door. And that was just never true, and it wasn't true. And that was why America lost Iraq War II after they won it. They had put people in power who hated their guts and wanted them out. All right. Then, it's important to note before we move on from Iraq War II that by taking the side of the Shiites in the Civil War, of course, they pushed the Sunnis, who had been the ruling caste, into a terrible, violent insurgency that killed 4,000 out of the 4,500 soldiers who died in that war, thousands more contractors, of course. But it also pushed them right into the arms of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Now, Al-Qaeda in Iraq hadn't even existed before the war. Saddam Hussein was terrified of Osama bin Laden. He wasn't allies with these terrorists. In fact, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the founder of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, didn't even pledge his loyalty to bin Laden until November 2004, fully a year and a half into the war, after the second battle of Fallujah. Only then did he say he was loyal to bin Laden and bin Laden's goals. And these are the guys that, for those of you who remember Iraq War II, the suicide bombers, the head choppers, the berserkers, the madmen, the people who would set off multiple suicide bombs in a giant crowd of Shiite civilian pilgrims, this kind of thing. And they did that in order to provoke a worse reaction, and provoke Shiite slaughter of innocent Shiites, of innocent Sunnis, which would then drive more people into their camp. Unfortunately, Zarqawi was really bad at math and didn't realize that the Sunni Arab Iraqis are only 20% of the population. And with the American Army and Marine Corps on the side of the Shiite supermajority and their allies, the Kurds in the north, the Sunnis didn't stand a chance. And so they lost, and they lost bad. But in the meantime, tens of thousands of new bin Ladenite terrorists were created in the world. But that's okay. Because, see, the Bush government decided to go right back to the Bill Clinton years, as though September 11th had never happened, as though these guys weren't the vanguard edge of the Sunni insurgency that had just killed 4,000 of our guys, or were in the process at that time of killing 4,500 of our guys. He decided to tilt right back toward the bin Ladenites. The policy is called the redirection, and I beg you to read this article by Seymour Hersh in the New Yorker magazine from 2007. If they try to stick you behind a paywall, just put the link in archive.is. They'll show you the whole thing. And you will laugh, you will cry, you will read it twice. It is incredible. And what they did was they said, you know what, we really screwed up. We just fought, we're in the middle of fighting, a war for our Shiite enemies, allied with Iran, who hate our guts. And all of our allies in the region are mad as hell. And thanks to Julian Assange, who's being essentially slowly murdered in solitary confinement at the behest of the Joe Biden administration in England right now, we have from the WikiLeaks, from the beginning of 2006, where neoconservative policy advisor Zalmay Khalilzad went to meet with the Saudi king. And the Saudi king says, what in the world are you guys doing? It used to be us and you and Saddam against Iran. Now you have given Iraq to Iran on a golden platter. We have silver platters. They're very fancy over there. Saudi royalty. Golden platters. And Khalilzad says, yes, Your Highness, you're so right and we're so sorry. But we're going to make it up to you. And that was when they started backing the terrorists again. And this is not, the change does not come with Barack Obama. The change comes in the second term of W. Bush. We're in the middle of fighting a war for the Shiites we hate, and who hate us? Well, we better tilt back toward Al-Qaeda, who, well, I guess we don't hate, but hates us. And so they started backing Al-Qaeda-linked groups, Fatah al-Islam, and I forgot the other one in Lebanon, Muslim Brotherhood groups in Syria, where guess what? Liz Cheney, the congresswoman from Wyoming, she worked in the State Department and was in charge of building this government in exile based on the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria. And other worse groups even than them. And then they started backing a really bad group of head-chopping, suicide-bombing marauders inside Iran called Jandala. This is the explanation, because I know you guys were wondering. But Scott, why did Barack Obama back Al-Qaeda in Syria all those years? What could he possibly have been thinking? Was Barack Obama a secret Muslim from Kenya, loyal to the goals of the Islamists at our expense? No. He was W. Bush. That's all he was. And what he did when he came in was pick up right where W. Bush left off. Now, they backed the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group and the other bin Ladenite terrorists in Libya. That wasn't exactly part of this program, although it was very much what the Saudis wanted. It wasn't against the Shiites, it was just against Muammar Gaddafi, who they hated. But the real scandal of Libya is that they then took all the Mujahideen and the weapons and sent them on to the next fight in Syria. And this is all important. Again, in the clean break thinking of the neoconservatives, Syria is the keystone in the arc of power between Iran and Hezbollah. Now, we have just added Iraq to Iran's side of the ledger. Now, this arc of power is even more dangerous to Israel than before. So something's got to be done. And something means backing bin Ladenite terrorists, the radical Sunni terrorists against Bashar al-Assad, the secular Alawite Ba'athist dictator, the guy with the clean-shaven chin and the three-piece suit. And we have to get rid of him because he's allies with Iran. And in fact, Jeffrey Goldberg in the spring of 2012 asked Barack Obama in an interview for The Atlantic, he said, "Don't you think that if we got rid of Bashar al-Assad in Damascus, that would be a great way to bring Iran down a peg?" And Obama says, "Absolutely." And Goldberg says, "Well, isn't there anything that we could do to help this process along?" And Obama says, "Well, I can tell you, Jeffrey, but your classified clearance isn't high enough." A less funny version of that, I'd tell you, but I'd have to kill you joke, right? In other words, there already is a covert operation ongoing to accomplish exactly those ends. And from the very beginning, from the first year of the Arab Spring in 2011, we knew, all the critics knew, and it was because the bad guys admitted it, that the people that we are backing on the ground there are bin Ladenite terrorists. You can talk all day about some supposed socialists and leftists and mythical moderates, but Assad's enemies in the Syrian war were led by Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the bad guys from Iraq War II. And Obama started backing them in Syria in 2011 when we still had guys on the Iraqi side of the border. We're using drones to chase Al-Qaeda in Iraq across the border into Syria, where now they're the good guys, the moderate rebels, the al-Nusra Front. And after supporting the al-Nusra Front in Syria for 2 years, in the spring of 2013, ISIS broke away from Al-Qaeda in Syria. This was essentially the Iraqi-dominated faction of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, splitting away from the Syrian-dominated faction of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, in Syria. And the new leader, Baghdadi, said, contrary to Al-Qaeda's goals of just keep fighting until the Americans are gone and out of the way so we can have our revolutions, he said, "I want my revolution now." And Zawahiri told him no, and he said, "You've made your law, let's see you enforce it," from hiding in your mom's basement in Pakistan or wherever you are, old man. And so Zarqawi couldn't enforce it. So Baghdadi declared a state and consolidated power over all of eastern Syria in 2013. 6 months later, somebody raised a black flag over a government building in Fallujah, Iraq, about 30 miles west of Baghdad. And somebody asked Barack Obama about this. "Hey, what's up with ISIS, this Al-Qaeda-like group that just raised the black flag in Fallujah, Iraq?" And Obama compared them to the junior varsity team. He said, "Just because you put a jersey on, that doesn't make you Kobe Bryant." But who was ISIS? This wasn't a new group. This was Al-Qaeda in Iraq. These are the worst guys from the last war. And there was just no mistaking that. But Obama didn't want to hear it. He had his Syria policy, and he was sticking with it. So 6 months after that, Baghdadi and ISIS rolled back into western Iraq and conquered the whole thing in about 2 weeks. They sacked Mosul, Fallujah, Baiji, Tikrit, Samarra. I'm not sure why Ramadi took them another year, but they ended up taking Ramadi. And this was like, and you guys remember the footage of this, when ISIS rolled into western Iraq, this was like Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. This is what it looks like when Al-Qaeda takes over a country. right? And mercilessly slaughtering captives and civilians, throwing gay men off of rooftops and whatever else. And then this is what started then Iraq War III, which Obama declared in August of 2014. Again, putting America right back on the side of the Iraqi Shiites and the Iranians, who they wished they hadn't fought Iraq War II for. This was the reason they had supported the terrorists in Syria, was to try to make up for their mistake in Iraq War II. But in trying to make up for that mistake, they made a bigger one. And they created the actual Islamic Caliphate that was always the most ridiculous war propaganda. You know, Glenn Beck spouting off about the Caliphate in the W. Bush years. What Caliphate? Where is it? There's nothing but nation states in the way. There's no Caliphate. When they killed bin Laden in the spring of 2011, the Caliphate, this guy was hiding in the attic even from his wife. In the suburbs, in Pakistan. But it took W. Bush turning all of Western Iraq into lawless, open Jihadistan. And it took Barack Obama supporting the Al-Qaeda terrorists in Syria to make that Islamic Caliphate actually come true for them. Then they had to go back to war to smash it, to correct from that massive error. And they launched another war, Iraq War III, which killed another 500,000 people or more in Iraq and Syria, absolutely decimated the cities of Fallujah, Ramadi, Mosul, and Raqqa in Syria as well, the ISIS capital in Syria. And killed hundreds of thousands of more people there. And I'm sorry, I got too many things. What's my time like here?
Whenever you're right, whenever you're ready.
Okay. So one more thing here I want to talk about Yemen. It's slightly off the narrative, but not really. It's part of America's tension with Iran, of course, has been the lie that they're making nuclear weapons. They've been telling this. The Israelis and their partisans in the United States have been accusing Iran of making nuclear weapons since 1992. That was when Benjamin Netanyahu first made this claim. Well, they still don't have a single atom bomb, which, as you all know, is 1940s technology. The reason why they don't have a single one yet is because they haven't attempted to make a single one yet. And every time in your life that you have heard otherwise, they were lying to you. Iran does not have a nuclear weapons program. They never had a nuclear weapons program. And even whatever supposed research that they had done into possibly developing nuclear weapons is actually all that is based on misunderstood and badly taken intelligence. It's just not true. The first Ayatollah Khomeini had forbidden it in the 1980s, and the current Ayatollah Khamenei had reaffirmed the same restriction in our era. What they have is essentially a latent nuclear deterrent. The same as Japan, the same as Brazil. They have proven that they have mastered the nuclear fuel cycle. They have proven essentially that they have a gun in one pocket and bullets in the other. Don't make us load our gun. Don't make us go so far as to make a nuclear weapon. Okay? That's what they have. Now, the fact that you've been lied to about this nonstop for 25 years is pretty important. And as you may know, the threat of Iran achieving nuclear weapons status in the W. Bush years, in the 2000s, very nearly led to war in 2007. And in the Obama years, in 2012 and 11 and 12, the Israelis had a massive campaign of assassination of Iranian nuclear scientists, including a graduate student. And they were threatening, they were practicing airstrikes in Cyprus, which is about the same distance from Israel as Iran's nuclear facilities at Natanz and so forth. And the Obama government was really worried. And I'm 99% certain that Netanyahu was just bluffing, but Obama went for it. And so what he did in signing the nuclear deal of 2015, negotiating that nuclear deal and finally signing it, he was not taking the threat of an Iranian nuclear weapon off the table. What he was doing was he was taking the threat of a war over this false narrative of an Iranian nuclear weapons program off the table. We already had the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and Iran already had a safeguards agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency, which routinely and always, a million times over, had verified the non-diversion of nuclear material in Iran to any military or other special purpose, as they put it. But that wasn't good enough. For some reason, on ABC and CNN and NBC and Fox and in the Washington Post and the New York Times, and oh my God, the New York Times, David Sanger, to them, Iran has a nuclear weapons program. It's just a flat fact. We know they do, and they're going to make a nuclear bomb, and they'll probably do a first strike against Israel if we don't stop them first. And that narrative just would not die, no matter how little there ever was to back it up. So that was the purpose of a nuclear deal with Iran, was just to take that threat of war over the fake threat of their nuclear program off the table. And it worked, by the way. Not even the Israelis have pretended to believe the Iranians are making nuclear weapons since the JCPOA of 2015. But here's the real problem, though. The Saudis were freaked out by this nuclear deal. The Saudis thought that Barack Obama was planning on tilting back towards Iran. Now, those of us who know the first thing about American politics know that that is absolutely not true. That is absolutely impossible, that America is going to tilt toward Iran over the dead body of the Israelis and the Saudi lobby in this country. No chance. Nor did Barack Obama want to do that. He was just trying to take the threat of war off the table. That's it. But the Saudis were worried that they were going to lose their place in our order in the Middle East. And so, in order to prove the superpower, the world empire's loyalty to its client state, Barack Obama helped Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Al-Qaeda launch a war in Yemen in the spring of 2015. Now, I'll skip the prelude to how it all got this way because it'll take too long, but suffice it to say that a group of Shiites took control over the capital city of Sana'a at the end of 2014. The Saudis were really upset about this and pretended to believe, although I don't think anybody really believed this, that the Houthis were just the sock puppets of the Iranians. This represented an Iranian beachhead on the Arabian Peninsula and all these things. All of that was just absolutely exaggerated. It was never true. And here's something that, again, is not secret, but is not very well known. And that is that at the end of 2014, when the Houthis, this Shiite group, when they took over the capital city of Sana'a, the Americans didn't really care. Oh, wait, which Americans? The military didn't really care. The military said, hey, wait, you guys are Shiites? And they said, yeah. And they said, and you hate Al-Qaeda guys? And they said, yeah, we do. They hate us. To Al-Qaeda, the Houthis are heretics with no right but to die. They're the Houthis' sworn enemies. And the Americans said, cool. Our current defense secretary, General Lloyd Austin, he was the commander of Central Command at the time. And it's in the Wall Street Journal from January of 2015. And Barbara Slavin wrote an article in Al Monitor, also in January of 2015. She had Michael Vickers, the Deputy Secretary of Defense for Intelligence, came to the Atlantic Council and gave a big talk about Iran and addressed the Houthi issue at the end. And according to this Wall Street Journal story and Michael Vickers' own words to Barbara Slavin, America made a new alliance with the Houthis. You guys like killing Al-Qaeda guys? We like seeing Al-Qaeda guys killed. Here's some intelligence to use to target and kill them. That was in January of 2015. Just 2 months later, Barack Obama stabbed them in the back and took Al-Qaeda's side against them. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, the guys that blew up the Khobar Towers in 1996, the guys that blew up the USS Cole in the year 2000, the guys who tried to blow up a plane over Detroit with the underpants bomb on Christmas Day 2009 and launched 2 different bombing plots, both luckily failed with the printer cartridges in the Obama years. And they are also the men who were behind the attacks in Belgium And in France, there was the Charlie Hebdo attack, the Eagles of Death metal concert, all of those. That was Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula who'd done that. And Obama took their side and has been backing them and their Saudi and UAE allies against this Shiite group in Sana'a for now 6.5 years. And it's what you guys remember from Libya, what Obama called leading from behind. Oh, the war in Libya? Oh, that's all France and Britain's fault. It's just American planes and American bombs and American logistics and American money and American everything. But no, it's France and Britain. They're the ones leading the war. Well, they pull the same thing here. As if you look it up in the newspaper today, it's the Saudi-led coalition that's bombing the Yemenis. But who's the superpower and who's the client state? Why is it that Saudi Arabia came to Washington, D.C. and explicitly asked permission from the Barack Obama government to start this war? Because America is the empire and Saudi is the client state. This is the American-led coalition. But they don't fight the wars the way the Americans fight the wars. And I gotta tell you, and I'm the first one to tell you, the Americans have killed and gotten killed somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 million people in the last 20 years. Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Iraq again, and Yemen. Okay? But in none of those wars, excluding Yemen, I don't believe the Americans have ever had a policy of deliberately targeting and killing civilians. That's what they call collateral damage. Those are just the breaks. But in Yemen, the policy from the very beginning has been to target civilians. And not just civilian infrastructure, water, electricity, sewage, garbage, the hospitals, the farms, the grain silos, the fishermen's boats, the horses in their stables, flocks of sheep in their fields. But the actual civilian population themselves, carpet bombing their apartment buildings and civilian neighborhoods. And officially, they've killed 250,000 people there. I guarantee you, by the time the war is over in Yemen, and they count the excess death rate, it'll be more than 1 million people killed just in this one war. It's the poorest country in the Middle East. They were already importing something like 80 to 90% of their food resources before the war started. You guys have heard of globalization? Well, listen, instead of growing sorghum and millet, sustenance crops to eat, you know what you Yemenis should be doing, said the World Bank. You guys should be growing cotton and coffee for sale on the world market. Then you take all that money and you'll be eating Brazilian steaks and Florida oranges and you'll be importing your food and having food from all around the world. Won't that be great? Sure, I guess. Until the U.S. Navy puts you under a total blockade for 6.5 years. Then you lay down and die. And that's what they've been doing, starving to death. I dare any of you to just put the words Yemeni child into your Google image search results. At some point, even the New York Times finally went and toured the hospitals and showed these babies are starving to death. They've had the worst cholera outbreaks in recorded history, which means since World War II, which means worse than what H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton deliberately inflicted on the Iraqis during Iraq War I.5. Thousands of people have died of cholera, and when I say people, I mean little babies and toddlers. They vomit and defecate themselves to death. And that's the USA behind every bit of that. And then when they build a cholera hospital, we bomb it. Now, I don't know if you guys know much about cholera. You actually don't even need antibiotics. You just need clean water and a few days. But they don't have it. So they lie down and die. And it's virtually the same thing across the Gulf there in Somalia, where America's war there has abetted the sun in its famines inflicted on those poor people twice over the last 20 years as well. Now, when Joe Biden came into power, he swore he would end the Yemen war, but he didn't. In fact, they just announced 2 days ago they approved a brand new sale of Raytheon weapons to Saudi Arabia for use against these helpless people who never attacked us, who never threatened us. Again, the only Yemenis who ever attacked the United States are the people that we are backing on the ground right now. And speaking of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, at times they had seized and controlled multiple towns, as many as 7 towns at a time, including the major port city of Makalla, its entire tax base, military bases, and weapons magazines. When this phase of the war is over, and we switch back to fighting Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, as I'm sure we will at some point before too long, we're going to have an entire massive new monster of an Al-Qaeda movement there in Yemen to fight, far worse than it could ever have possibly been under the old regime. And by the way, Barack Obama had been bombing them since '09 before he switched sides in the war, but that wasn't killing him. It was only growing him stronger and stronger. But taking their side, this treason, this genocide, has led to Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula being more powerful than any Al-Qaeda group, at least after the Caliphate, when they had seized eastern Syria and western Iraq. Which brings me to wrap up then here with my old friend Jeff Huber. He used to write for us at antiwar.com. He'd been a Navy commander and was a great satirist. And he wrote this article in 2011, just after bin Laden was finally put down in that Navy SEAL raid. It's called Osama bin Laden, Dead and Loving It. And he begins, "Eat your heart out, Charlemagne. Et tu, Julius Caesar. And how do you like them apples, Alexander? Because here lies the greatest general in world history. Osama bin Laden, who didn't even have a single division of men of his own to command, and yet can hide in the attic and command the greatest armies in the history of the world, from place to place, from one goat rope misadventure to the other, across the world until we are bogged down, bled to bankruptcy, and our empire is finally broken, just as he always wanted." And who was it who did it for him? Who has accomplished all of Osama bin Laden's goals? The United States of America, led by George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, who, by the way, continued every single one of these policies, other than he did negotiate our way out of Afghanistan, thank goodness. And Biden stuck with that. Well, he kicked the can down the road a few months, but he did eventually stick with that and get us out of Afghanistan. But other than that, all this continues. There's a brand new article in the Military Times just last week that said that we're only just getting started. Special operations forces have identified bin Ladenite-type enemies in Iraq and Syria, and of course, all throughout Africa, where the war in Libya spread down to Mali, Sierra Leone, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, and Nigeria, where the Libyan jihadists eventually took advantage of the crisis in Mali to link up with Boko Haram from Nigeria and help make them that much worse. And so Special Operations Forces, SOCOM, have determined that they have still a generation worth of war to fight in the Middle East and across Africa in the name of putting down the bin Ladenites that our government has done, one, so much to empower when they fought them, and two, done that much more to empower when they've actually taken their side, such as in Libya, Syria, Iraq, and now in Yemen. And it's just a disgrace. The whole thing never had to happen. As Gary Burnson, who I told you was the second CIA commander on scene at Tora Bora in Afghanistan in 2001, in 2016 he admitted to the journalist Michael Hirsch, this whole war could have been over by Christmas. If we just focused on getting bin Laden at Tora Bora, which, by the way, I'm sorry I skipped this part, I should have mentioned, and I do mention in the book, they could have negotiated extradition. They didn't even have to invade even to get bin Laden at all, but presuming that they needed violent action to get bin Laden and his friends, they didn't have to do a regime change in Kabul. Anthony Zinni, the former commander of CENTCOM, admitted the same. The entire war on terrorism could have been over by the end of 2001. We could have lived this entire era, this last generation, the first 20 years of this, not just new century, but new millennium in peace and prosperity and security. But unfortunately, our security forces have seen it in their interests to behave in the opposite manner. And now they want to pick a fight with Russia and China for you. You ready? Thank you.
Done was had him start half an hour earlier. Scott, thank you so much. Your talks are always super informative, and it really lets people know where the proverbial bear shits in the woods as far as U.S. foreign policy. So thank you very much. We appreciate it.